Good afternoon and welcome to the 2021 Coalition for a Prosperous America Annual Conference. This year we are virtual and I really do appreciate everybody coming in and joining us live. I'd like to go ahead and introduce you to our moderator of the Reshoring Healthcare Panel, Rosemary Gibson, author of China RX. Hi, Rosemary.
Melissa, thank you so much. It's great to be here. Our panel's ready to go as we all come on. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to all of you, and thank you for joining us. Just a brief background on the Healthcare Committee. The committee was born during the pandemic as the Strategic National Stockpile was literally running out of PPE and gloves and gowns and testing kits, which that made headline news. Behind the scenes, the Strategic National Stockpile was also running out of essential generic drugs for hospitals. And these are the medicines that were used to treat COVID patients who were seriously ill. And it came to be known among federal officials that we could not restock the Strategic National Stockpile on our own. And that's because we don't have the manufacturing capability to do it. From official sources, privately, 80% of what is in the Strategic National Stockpile depends to some degree on components made in China. And so here we had a pandemic where it started in Wuhan, moved around the world, and we had 100 countries competing for the same products for their own populations. So it became evident that the United States needed to have domestic manufacturing capability to produce essential medicines and supplies. This is a matter of life and death and a matter of survival. And just to punctuate this point, we are not able to make antibiotics in the United States. We cannot make penicillin. We can't make the antibiotics for your bronchitis or pneumonia. And thousands of other basic medicines. These are the generics, these are the commodity products, and they're 90% of the medicines that people take and use every day. So it's incumbent upon us to have some domestic manufacturing capability. So the mission of the Cpa Committee is very clear. It's to support domestic manufacturers, to advocate for federal policies to rebuild our manufacturing base, and to sustain it and to grow it. And this has to be done in partnership with federal partners because the market alone cannot fix it. And for the next hour or so, you'll hear about the unlevel playing field and why we need public-private partnerships to take this forward. So it gives me great pleasure now to introduce our panel and our CPA members. Usman Ahmed. Hello, Usman. Great to see you. Welcome.
Hi, Rosemary. Thank you for having us.
Usman is Chief Operating Officer at Nexus Pharmaceuticals. Nexus is woman-owned, privately held, based in Illinois. And we're going to hear from Usman about the new manufacturing facility that you'll be opening up very soon in Wisconsin. So great to have you join us.
Thank you.
Eric Edwards, Dr. Eric Edwards. Eric, great to see you. Thanks for being with us. Eric is CEO of Phlow Corporation, and he can explain what Phlow means. It's a play on flow chemistry, which is this new whiz-bang advanced manufacturing capability. And Phlow is a public benefit corporation, wants to do things with a mission, and it has an ambitious goal to make fully made end-to-end essential generics right here in the United States. So Eric, we look forward to hearing more about that.
Great, thank you.
And John Toomey is Director of Government Relations at CPA. John is leading the efforts for the Healthcare Committee on advocacy on the Hill and in the administration. John brings a tremendous background on Capitol Hill and working with private industry. And I can say on a personal note from many conversations that John is personally deeply committed to the mission of our Healthcare Committee. So before we go into our panel discussion, we're really honored today to have a message from Congresswoman Vicky Hartzler, Republican from Missouri. Together, she and Congressman John Garamendi from California introduced one of the first bipartisan bills. This was back in October 2019, before the pandemic. That recognize the public security and national security issues arising from the fact that we have lost so much of our manufacturing base. So we are so grateful for their leadership on this issue, and she'll give us an update on the legislation on the bill that she introduced with Congressman Garamendi. So Melissa will tee up that video for us. It's just about 3.5 minutes, and then we'll jump right into our panel discussion.
Thank you for inviting me to speak at your annual trade conference to discuss the importance of securing the U.S. pharmaceutical supply chain. For over a year, I have been working with my colleague and friend, Congressman John Garamendi of California, to address the United States' reliance on Chinese pharmaceuticals. As you know, China is the principal developer of active pharmaceutical ingredients for generic prescription drugs, which account for approximately 90% of pharmaceuticals used in the United States. The COVID-19 pandemic shed light on this serious vulnerability for both national security and public health. As a nation, we were faced with the reality that we did not have enough medical supplies here at home to address the pandemic. This public health crisis demonstrated a real urgency in ending China's chokehold on the global medical supply chain. Prior to the COVID-19 pandemic, Congressman Garamendi and I acknowledged the threats posed by this dangerous vulnerability and worked together to introduce bipartisan legislation. In October of 2019, we introduced the Pharmaceutical Independence Long-Term Readiness Reform Act. This legislation would require the Department of Defense to identify the vulnerabilities faced by our country's dependence on Chinese pharmaceuticals and to only purchase American-made raw materials, medicines, and vaccines for our troops. As members of the House Armed Services Committee, we were successful in including part of this legislation in the annual National Defense Authorization Act for fiscal year 2021. Our provision requires the national security strategy to include, for the provision of drugs, biological products, vaccines, and critical medical supplies required to enable combat readiness and protect the health of the armed forces. Additionally, the provision included in the NDAA requires a detailed report on the vulnerabilities to the medical supply chain of the United States from foreign nations like China. This report is required to be completed by March 1st of 2022, and I look forward to reviewing the information provided. I am pleased that both the Trump and Biden administrations have taken this vulnerability seriously by taking steps to increase production of critical medical supplies and drugs in the United States. Last September, the Department of Defense and the Department of Health and Human Services signed a $20 million contract with On-Demand Pharmaceuticals to develop a domestic production capability for critical active pharmaceutical ingredients. On January 15th of this year, 2021, the two agencies jointly awarded a $69.3 million contract to Continuous Pharmaceuticals to develop a domestic production capability for critical active pharmaceutical ingredients and final dosage form medicines using their proprietary integrated continuous manufacturing technology. Additionally, the Biden administration is currently undergoing a 100-day review to address the vulnerabilities in the pharmaceutical and active pharmaceutical ingredient supply chains. Much progress has been made since Congressman John Garamendi and I first introduced our legislation in 2019. It will take a whole-of-nation approach, government working with private sector, to fully secure our supply chain. I will continue to work with my colleagues to address this issue and to ensure all Americans have safe and reliable medications produced here in the United States. Thank you.
Well, we're very grateful to Congresswoman Hartzler for that very important message, and to both her and Congressman Garamendi for their leadership early on. And we'll be talking in just a few minutes about policy solutions in a federal and private sector partnership, and we'll come back to some of her key points. Where I'd like to start, though, is, Usman and Eric, you are leaders in domestic companies here, and you both have fascinating stories to tell about how you got started. Usman, as I recall, your family pooled all of its life savings to start Nexus. And Eric, you started in the middle of a crisis in our country. So Usman, why don't you go ahead and briefly tell us the story about your company and how it got started.
Sure. Thank you very much, Rosemary. So Nexus Pharmaceuticals, we were founded in 2003. It's a family-owned pharmaceutical company. It's started by my parents. My mother, she was an organic chemist and worked in the industry for quite some time. And my father was an analytical chemist and worked for various pharmaceutical companies. So in 2003, they decided to start their own pharmaceutical company. Initially, when we started it, we were 100% virtual. It started in my parents' living room. Company that my mom used to work for. They did all the R&D development, and we used a contract manufacturer and a sales and marketing partner. And over the last 17 years, we've slowly been vertically integrating and expanding our portfolio. And in 2011 or 12, we decided we really want to build our own manufacturing facility. And we noticed that a lot of the multinational corporations and just a lot of the pharmaceutical manufacturing, especially on the generic side and the injectable side, had been shifting overseas to India and China. And we saw that, we had done audits of a lot of these facilities and seen some of the quality issues that were popping up. So in 2018, we decided to build our own manufacturing facility. We are building a brand new $100 million state-of-the-art injectable manufacturing facility in Pleasant Prairie, Wisconsin. Will be operational this summer, and really excited to work with CPA in terms of expanding the mission of bringing back domestic manufacturing.
So this one, it sounds like it's pretty clear that you and your company saw a future for domestic production of these sterile injectables.
Correct. Yeah. So when we first, started the idea of we wanted to build our own manufacturing facility, everyone thought we were crazy for choosing the U.S. They told us, everyone else is going to India, China. Why are you going to be manufacturing in the U.S.? But at the end of the day, our family owns the company, so we think really any of us or any of our friends or family members could be patients taking the medication. So that was always top of mind for us. So patient safety first. And we had done audits of overseas facilities and kind of some of the, obviously in the book that you wrote, China RX, you highlight so many of the issues, quality issues. So for us, we knew we wanted to build a facility in the US, and with new technology and with government support, we really feel that we can be successful. And I think the COVID pandemic really shone a spotlight on the vulnerability about how we don't have enough manufacturing in the US. So that was kind of the driving factor of that.
Thank you, Usman. It's a great point about quality, and we'll come back to that in just a couple minutes. So Eric, tell us about Phlow. You were busy last year.
It's been a busy year, but it's been a great year, and just thrilled to have an opportunity to help out during this pandemic. So Phlow, the idea around Phlow started actually in 2019, pre-pandemic. We were working on strategic challenges that our country were facing specific to drug shortages. We've had perpetual drug shortages in this country, and our co-founder, Dr. Frank Gupton, who used to run process development at Boehringer Ingelheim Pharmaceuticals, he had been focusing on applying flow chemistry, which is a continuous manufacturing approach, a process development approach, an advanced manufacturing approach to drugs in the developing world. He had received a $40 million grant from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, focused on HIV, TB, and malaria drugs, and he had proven that he could reduce the cost and improve the quality of these key essential generic medicines in these developing nations, again, focused on HIV, TB, and malaria. He approached me to say, how can we apply this technology domestically and focus on real problems that the United States is facing? And we started looking at drugs in shortage. We contacted a colleague, Martin Van Triest. He's the former chief quality officer of Amgen and now the CEO of Civica, the largest nonprofit pharmaceutical company in America. And then we began basically discussing how could we work together to really chip away at these essential medicine shortages that this country has been facing. All this had begun in 2019. We started building the team. We actually had our first formal FDA meeting, and things kind of started heading in a direction where Phlow was going to help manufacture the active pharmaceutical ingredients for Civica and others, while we were also going to build our own medicines that were in shortage for other special populations, including the pediatric population, children's hospitals. And then COVID hit. And when COVID hit, we started looking at the essential medicine list the drugs that we had prioritized that were in shortage and had vulnerable supply chains. And we saw a significant overlap between these medicines that we were going to be focusing on and serving the population and the children's hospitals, and those essential medicines that were going to be needed for the COVID-19 response. These are hospitalized COVID patients that need critical care medicines, medicines for anesthesia, for sedation, for pain management, key antibiotics, and other medicines. So as Rosemary alluded to, when the pandemic began and there was kind of a rush on PPE and where are we going to find enough ventilators, we were the first in the country to kind of raise a flag to the administration and key HHS officials to say, you're not going to be able to ventilate someone if you don't have the key drugs used for intubation. And that led Phlow to really jump right in and say, we already had a plan for these pediatric patients in shortage. We can pivot immediately and make sure that we have a short-term rapid surge response to help support getting these key essential medicines into the strategic national stockpile because there were none available, and try to prevent another disaster, a disaster that would transcend just treating COVID-19 patients, as a lot of these medicines are used for critical illnesses across the spectrum, whether they're myocardial infarction or stroke or other infectious diseases. These medicines are needed for surgery and normal procedures, but they're also used for critical COVID patients. So we jumped right in, started manufacturing these medicines, leveraging contract manufacturers and strategic partnerships that we had built with Ampac Fine Chemicals in Virginia, Civica and others, while applying for a very large contract to repatriate and reshore the key essential medicine industrial base for this country. And that ultimately led into a very large HHS, ASPR, the Assistant Secretary for Preparedness and Response, and BARDA, the Biomedical Advanced Research and Development Authority contract, which was awarded to Phlow in May of last year, to begin rebuilding this critical infrastructure. And Phlow can't do it alone. You've heard about others starting to work on this, whether that's on-demand pharmaceuticals or continuous. The key is that we needed to catalyze industry change. We need to move the industry into advanced manufacturing approaches that can allow us to drive down the cost of these essential medicines, improve the quality, and most importantly, assure affordability for our healthcare system. And so Phlow's been really trying to play a leadership role and providing thought leadership to our federal government, but also building unique customer coalitions and partnerships in order to reimagine the supply chain, what we like to say, from molecule to bedside. And we just announced last week a Children's Hospital Coalition, a first of its kind alliance in order to provide essential medicines in shortage for some of our most vulnerable patient populations, a special population, pediatrics. And we'll continue to grow unique customer coalitions to try to solve this vexing problem that we're going to be talking about as we think about how do we secure our essential medicine supply chain. So we're thrilled to be a part of the panel and looking forward to discussing this topic in more detail.
Eric and Usman, when I hear you speak, it's clear that what you're doing is really creating a new supply chain. We've had one that's been broken, even in the best of times, with hundreds of drugs in shortage. You know, these are not in just rural hospitals, but in very prominent hospitals. They'll be trading off one another. Cleveland Clinic will contact Johns Hopkins and actually trade medicines that they need because of shortages. It's really quite shocking. Mm-hmm. So what you're doing is creating a new supply chain.
You know, and Rosemary, a lot of the general public, they don't even know that these shortages exist. I mean, when we announced our Children's Hospital Coalition launch last week, it was just amazing to hear from these reporters and others that, whoa, you mean children's hospitals are struggling to get the medicines we need for pediatrics, for children? And so our country, they don't realize that essential medicine shortages, they can lead to medication errors. They can compromise and delay patient care. And most importantly, and significantly, they can replace first-line, best-in-class therapies with alternative solutions that are not as safe or effective. And these hospitals work dozens of hours a week just to find the medicines they need. And it's a huge problem. And a lot of it has been brought on, unfortunately, by this offshoring of this key industrial base overseas.
You know, truth be told, no one likes to say this publicly, but I'll say it. There are probably thousands of people who die in this country every year because of shortages of vital medicines.
Yeah, yeah. But
And
Rosemary,
it's just not spoken. And a quick story, right before the shutdown, speaking of children's hospitals, I was at a children's hospital talking on a different subject. And one of the physicians said, well, there's a certain antibiotic that we can just not get. And this was before the pandemic was hitting. And then there was a wonderful person, a pharmacist there who was a volunteer on her local ambulance service. And she says, we can't even get the proper vials of epinephrine, which helps jumpstart people and saves them on the way to the hospital. So I said, what do you do then if you don't have epinephrine in your ambulance? And she said, well, we just tell the driver to drive faster to the hospital. It's really quite shocking. So these are problems that we have to tackle. And you're right, it's about rebuilding our infrastructure on an industrial base and to give contracts to domestic companies to ensure they have customers. John, I want to bring you in because you've been talking with people on the Hill, members and staff and people in the administration. And I heard you say that some of them are surprised that we actually have domestic companies like Phlow and Nexus that want to do this, and they're delighted by it. Tell us about that.
Well, that's right. I mean, I think, since standing up the committee, Rosemary, and really introducing companies like Phlow and Nexus and their capabilities to lawmakers on both sides of the aisle, they're thrilled to find out that these companies exist, and they want to know how they did it and what they need to be successful long term. We had one member meet with our group last fall. It was supposed to be a quick 30-minute conversation. I think it went well over an hour just because he was so intrigued and wanted to know more about the great work that these companies are doing. And so I think it shows a real desire from policymakers to find out about these folks, to learn more about what has been successful for them and what they can do from the federal government standpoint to make sure that they're successful long term. And so there's a great interest in this space, especially on folks on both sides of the aisle. And we've been really encouraged in our engagement with folks on the Hill and in the executive to support these companies and others. So really optimistic future for, I think, folks like Nexus and Phlow.
That's great, John. And I want to underscore for everybody that these are the generic drugs that we're talking about. These are the ones that have become commodities. And Usman, I want to bring you in about drug shortages. You've seen them and the impact that has. Tell us about that.
Yeah, as Eric was mentioning, this is pre-pandemic. This has just been going on for at least say 10 plus years, or as more and more of these products are being offshored, they're being made at facilities that maybe they had quality issues, so they're being on and off the market. 2017, sodium bicarbonate went on shortage, which is baking soda, and literally surgeries aren't being completed because there's not enough manufacturing. There's no domestic manufacturers for these key products. There's critical oncology products. There was a New York Times article in 2019 about vincristine. It doesn't sell for a lot, but it's a critical product used for pediatric cancer. So shortages are just getting worse and worse. And I think there has to be an initiative to understand that these, although they may be generic products, older products, they're still critical for the healthcare system. And I think to your point, I'm sure, there's been lots of deaths or surgeries postponed or adverse events because we couldn't get these critical medications.
I think some of you on the panel, and I'm sure some of our viewers will remember the recall of blood pressure medicines. Millions and millions of Americans had their blood pressure medicines recalled because there were carcinogens in them. And the worst offender, it was a company in China that had 200 times the acceptable limit of this carcinogen per pill. And this is the same carcinogen that's in rocket fuel. And so you had millions of people suddenly that they had to find an alternative source, which isn't easy. And I remember talking to a very senior federal official who's put out on social media that he was waiting 3 months for his generic prescription drug for blood pressure medicines. And that can increase the risks of heart attacks and strokes. So this is very real to people. But I want to come back to Eric. Eric, you're a volunteer physician on the EMS service in Richmond, and you tell a really compelling story about epinephrine.
Well, you had your EpiVal story, and I had it personally from the perspective of I'm still a medical director. In fact, I still train paramedics this evening. I'll be volunteering on an ambulance all night long, actually training paramedics. And, that's how I give back and stay in touch with patient care. About 10 months ago, during the pandemic, we got a call for a cardiac arrest with a 52-year-old male. We arrived on scene. Actually, he had just went into arrest, so he was still talking to the 911 dispatcher while we were on the way. So this is an acute emergency, and we had a chance. And I immediately intubated the patient. We started chest compressions, got the defibrillator and the cardiac monitor in place. I started the IV. Opened up the drug box, and typically we would have a pre-filled syringe of epinephrine, 1 to 10,000 concentration, ready to go. Open on the drug box, no epinephrine. We had to search through it and found an epinephrine vial for anaphylaxis, which was in a 1 to 1,000 concentration. And we had to creatively basically compound the right solution and dilution of this presentation of a key critical drug on the spot. So I took 9 cc's of saline, added it to 1 ml of epinephrine, and redid, unscrewed the needle, put a new needle on, withdrew the drug, and then finally gave the correct dose. It delayed care. And, I think as Rosemary mentioned, a lot of this goes unseen behind the scenes. We have heroes on the front lines of our hospital systems. I've met with these pharmacists. I've met with these physicians who are just doing the best they can to find the drugs they need to treat patients from whatever source they can find them in. And in America, a first world country, we should not have a third world distribution system. And certainly we should never, ever have to worry about whether or not a key essential medicine is going to be available when we call 911 for a family member. And that's really what we're talking about. We're talking about security and resecuring our supply chain and resiliency to ensure that all human beings have access to the key critical essential medicines necessary to sustain life and conquer disease. That's what we're solving for here. And it's unfortunate that even a company like Phlow has to exist. But in this country, we cannot be guaranteed to have the critical medicines for our family members and for our service members and for our veterans. So that's what we're going to be working on, and we can't do it alone. We need other companies to follow the lead here that we're trying to be a part of.
It's a very compelling story, Eric, and it happens every day, countless times around this country with many clinicians. John, I want to turn to you now, because I often get the question of, okay, so Rosemary, you say we need to bring manufacturing back to the U.S. It's just too big. We can't do that. But there was a very promising step that happened last fall, the end of October, when the FDA came out with an essential drug list, an essential medical supply list that set priorities for what we really need. So tell us a little bit about that, John, and why that's important.
Yeah, it's a great point, Rosemary. So last November, the FDA came out with a list of essential generic medicines that are, just necessary medicines that we need to make in this country. And folks ask us all the time when we meet with them, do you want to reshore everything? Do you want to bring back it all? And we say, well, that would be nice. But let's start with this list of essential medicines that the FDA has identified. This serves as a great guidepost and template and really starting block for lawmakers to wrap their heads around, okay, how do we now implement policy long-term that ensures that those products are being onshored, are being reshored, and that we're actually making those products here? And I know this is a discussion that folks have been asking now, as Leader Schumer looks at his new competitiveness bill that he's looking to roll out in the weeks ahead. And do they possibly address this issue about these essential medicines, and what policies might exist to make sure that we're making those medicines here? Maybe that will hinge on CMS participation in Medicare, Medicaid as part of a way of getting at domestic procurement for those essential medicines on that list. But I know right now folks are really looking at that. But that list is so essential because it really serves as the starting point for medicine that we need to make here.
That's absolutely right, John. And, it's great for policymakers to have some guideposts. And it also sends a tremendous signal to the marketplace that this is what the government is saying that we need. And Eric and both Usman, I think you both see alignment with that FDA essential drug list. Is that right, Usman? I see you shaking your head.
Correct. Yep. I think to John's point, we don't need to bring everything back all at once. As obviously it would be nice, but there are critical products. So, that shortage product I mentioned, sodium bicarbonate, that's on the essential medicine list. A couple of our products, sodium nitroprusside. So that would be a fantastic place to start to with that list. Yeah.
That's another drug, by the way, Usman, that emergency physicians and ERs have been really struggling to find, and it's kind of been a race to the bottom on this. I think it's a great point, right? We always say at Phlow that we're not against a global supply chain. We're just for a supply chain that focused on the domestic production of our key essential medicines, and we define those as priority medications considered to be the most effective and safe, and are critical to meet the needs of the American healthcare system, right? Priority medications needed to meet the needs of the American healthcare system. And we think about that definition and we look at the FDA essential medicines, there's 100% overlap with what we're looking to produce here. And we kind of guessed before that list came out on what we thought the key essential medicines we should be focusing on based off the COVID-19 priority list, the supply chain vulnerabilities for the key starting materials, critical inputs, and active pharmaceutical ingredients. And then when we saw that list come out, John, we were like, oh, thank you. These are the ones that we thought we should be making, and we've already, gotten a head start and are heading in that direction. So, but again, it's not like there are 5 or 10 on this list, right? There are over 100 of these medicines. And Phlow can't do it alone. Nexus can't do it alone. We must catalyze industry change. And to do that, our federal government needs to start thinking about these medicines differently.
Right.
Our healthcare providers, our insurers need to start looking at these medicines as not a commodity.
Right.
I think I've heard you say in the past, Rosemary, this should be a strategic asset, just as we have conversations around rare earth metals and other key aspects and key industrial bases. The essential medicine industrial base needs to be looked upon as a matter of not only national security, but national public health security. And it just hasn't been until we started seeing the vulnerabilities this pandemic exposed.
That's right, Eric. These products have been treated what I call like T-shirts. And let's find the cheapest possible place that we can buy them. And it doesn't matter if they wear out after 2 spins in the washing machine. We have to turn this from a commodity to these are really strategic assets. And I put them in the same category as food and energy. Because if you don't have them, a country will cease to function very quickly.
I love that T-shirt analogy. I think that's a great analogy. I mean, it's even worse than that. We have pharmaceutical manufacturers. It's like the college T-shirt provider, right? Where you've got pharma companies, right? That will literally say, "Hey, we'll give you this free T-shirt, this medicine, if you sign us up for a contract for these other medicines that actually matter the most." Right.
I'm sorry. In the local grocery store, I won't name they would say, come and get a free 2-week supply of antibiotics. I thought, oh my goodness, what does that do for antibiotic resistance, let alone why is it so cheap? But this is what's happened. It's become so cheap that it's destroyed the integrity of our system and what's produced. And the good guys that want to do it right, they have a hard time surviving. That's why we are where we are. And I want to be clear that the medicines we're talking about, it doesn't matter if you work in the White House, if you're a member of Congress, if you're an elite on Wall Street, you all get the same thing as everybody else.
Mm-hmm.
Whether you're Democrat or Republican, this is what we all share in common. So we all have a vested interest. And again, it's like food, it's like energy. We all need to have it when we need it.
It also doesn't matter if you're a Democrat or Republican. That's right. All of us are patients at the end of the day. And all of us have family members that suffer from chronic disease and might have a critical event. These are those critical essential medicines you need to sustain life. And to your point, Rosemary, they've been looked upon as if it isn't a patent protected, innovative, really technologically advanced drug, then why are we focusing on it? And that is a broken system. I can make an argument that it's just as important to protect these essential medicines as it is for us to think about that next vaccine that covers COVID variants, because it doesn't matter if you have the best vaccine in the world for COVID, if you can't actually treat someone who is critically ill or actually does get hospitalized, you're going to have much bigger problems than just COVID. And that's kind of trying to make sure people look at this differently and holistically. It requires new thinking.
It really does, and a new narrative to educate people about exactly what we're talking about. John, I want to bring up a point that you started to mention. That is, what about Medicare? Medicare is the biggest payer, and why can't we get more of Medicare paying for drugs that are made in the U.S. to support domestic manufacturing, but very importantly, to assure people who are covered by the program can trust that the medicines that they're getting are made the way they should be. What do you think about that?
Well, that's a great idea, Rosemary. I know you wrote about this in a recent op-ed a couple weeks ago, but this has been, discussed by both, the past two former administrations. I know this came up in the Obama administration at CMS, and I know this was discussed at CMS under the Trump administration, looking at CMS Medicare, Medicaid participation as a way of getting at procuring domestically made essential generics, as a way of, as you mentioned, tying in the big purchaser here to those essential generics and really making sure that they have a long-term policy in place for a purchaser. I think it's a great proposal to move forward with. I know folks have talked about this on the Hill, but I think it shows, some real legs, the fact that CMS has looked at this in the last two administrations, maybe now with COVID, with a renewed look at supply chain and how we can get these essential medicines, especially with the list in November. I think this offers a real chance moving forward for folks to, again, take a look at Medicare and Medicaid participation as a way of reshoring these essential generics.
Yeah, this was a topic that came up when it comes to national security. Let's incentivize the Department of Defense and the VA and the Strategic National Stockpile to prioritize domestic manufacturers. And the same would be true, it sounds like, from what you're saying, for the Medicare program.
It's almost like they need a kind of an approved domestic manufacturer list for these key essential medicines. And if you're on that approved list, they get prioritized as it relates to what would be procured or purchased if you're going to participate in a Medicaid or Medicare program. It's an interesting concept, because I think right now that extends things beyond just the armed services sector or the veteran sector. We've been looking at this. I think it's easy to say, hey, this is a matter of national security. We don't want soldiers on our battlefield, right? And we don't want veterans to have to be relying upon medicines or antibiotics that are only made by a potential adversary. That one makes sense, but it extends that into that government realm, into the public health realm through Medicare and Medicaid and these other populations, because it's no less important from a public health perspective versus a national security perspective.
That's right. And I want to bring Usman in here. Usman, you've seen these warning letters. You've read them. Mm-hmm. And it's really, I think most people would find it shocking that even companies, and these are warning letters that come as a result of FDA inspections, which are very intensive activities where FDA employees who are highly skilled go in and look at manufacturing facilities to see if they meet high specifications. I'll let you talk about this. Sure. And these warning letters come in, and these drugs are still allowed in to the United States, even though they have serious problems. Tell us about this.
Correct. Yeah, I know we're going to talk a little bit about it later in terms of policies, but to your point, we definitely need a level playing field in the sense that the FDA, when they come to our facility, they come unannounced, they stay for as long as they want, and they're able to do a very thorough inspection, as opposed to foreign facilities. They're calling months in advance. They're staying for a couple of days. I think the GAO just came out with a report saying that they're, I think, a backlog of 1,000 inspections for foreign facilities. And then additionally, as you just mentioned, during 2012, I believe after the passing of GDUFA, the FDA started doing unannounced inspections for a few years in India and China, and they were finding so many violations. I think it was something about 80% of the facilities that they were inspecting were for whether fraud or gross negligence. And, bathroom waste being found on the floor of this aseptic environment, data fraud, where they would test these products to show that it was, if it was equivalent to the innovator product, and it wasn't, and they were falsifying data. But this created such a problem because we did not have the infrastructure in the US, so that was creating drug shortages. So the FDA was saying, well, our hands are tied, because if we don't allow these products in, we won't be able to have critical antibiotics like azithromycin or critical products like just furosemide or these kind of generic products that people say. So the fact that we know that these products are sub-quality and they're still being used it's still being allowed. It just shows how critical, to Eric's point, it has to be a collective effort because so much of the manufacturing has gone overseas and so many of these facilities are subpar quality and they are allowing these warning letter products. So it's just becoming more and more, almost like a vicious cycle.
Well, notwithstanding, go ahead, Rosemary, I'm sorry.
Yeah, well, certainly the manufacturers have problems, but you have to ask the question, who are the American companies that are buying these substandard drugs?
Yeah. Well, when we talk with the hospitals, I'm sorry, Rosemary.
Yeah, who's buying them and selling them to hospitals and to these retail pharmacies? Yeah, go ahead, jump in.
I was going to say, when we talk with the hospitals and we let them know that, our product is made in the USA, we're always very transparent about, for our one product, isoproterenol, we get the API from North Carolina. It's manufactured in Baltimore. So we're very forthcoming about where our products are manufactured. But unfortunately, and I know hospitals, they're under tremendous pressure. The pharmacies are under tremendous pressure on drug costs, but they kind of push it back to us and they say, well, if these products were so bad, FDA would not allow them. So as long as it's FDA approved, that's what's most important for us. So that's why we're really excited about kind of some of the work that Phlow has been doing in terms of talking about why it's so important about where your product is made. But to your point, there's a lot of holes within the whole process. And
well, I think Usman, to your point, it requires an education effort, right? So I'll give you an example. Look what just happened in 2020. A lot of the folks who might be watching this may not have seen, but on March the 4th, a GAO report came out that said that the FDA was unable to complete more than 1,000 foreign inspections, more than 1,000. And 52 domestic inspections here in the US were unable to occur from March to October 2020. So, and during that time period, March to October 2020 of last year, the height of the pandemic, right? They only had 3 foreign inspections occur. So I think the way we need to be thinking about it as we talk to hospitals and as we talk to purchasers and pharmacists is we have to restore trust and confidence in the supply chain and in the system. We have to think differently around how we talk about what is quality. And quality is more than just having an FDA approved drug. Quality is making sure that you have a drug that has regular quality standards, regular audit, regular inspections that occur in the facility and is not at risk for future supply chain disruptions or the potential for something like a future public health emergency where the FDA is unable to even follow up on an inspection and the hospital purchaser won't hear about that issue for months, 6 months, 8 months, maybe even longer. So it's about restoring confidence in what a domestic supply chain means for trust as they're giving it to these patients. And these conversations have been helpful as we talk to hospital purchasers about how do you know your drug is X, or how can you be sure that the pricing won't go here or here? And we can provide certainty and predictability with domestic manufacturing that just doesn't exist elsewhere.
Well, I think we can take it even a step further, Eric, because I'm starting to tell hospitals now that you are effectively using unregulated products because the heart of the FDA regulatory process is these very in-depth inspections. I'm told, Usman, that for a sterile injectable facility, complex facility, the FDA in the US could be there for 3 weeks.
Correct. Yeah.
And they look at everything.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So we have outsourced a country with different regulatory standards, but then with no inspections at all by the FDA. These are unregulated products, and hospitals, there's no excuse for you not to know this. This has been all over the newspapers that the FDA is not in those plants. And so you are at risk that if there's a problem with a drug, so sourcing domestically is a risk mitigation strategy. And as we saw during COVID, hospitals that had reliable suppliers like Civica RX, their costs actually went down. They saved money. Plus, they had the assurance that they were getting a quality drug, and Civica goes in and inspects those facilities. So this really is a quality issue, and I think that would be a very sensitive one, not only for the military, but also for Medicare, for older adults who are covered by those programs, as well as Medicaid. So we have about 15 minutes left, and I want to turn now to John, a question about what shifts do you see in the administration? We've had administration come and go and a new one in. And what do you see in terms of policy, and what do you see as opportunities for advancing the committee's agenda for domestic manufacturers? And by the way, for those of you who have any questions or comments, please go on the chat line and we'll try to pick those up before we close. So John?
Great questions, Rosemary. I just quickly like to add on to the warning letter issue. Jeff Fortenberry, Republican from Nebraska, and Mark Pocan, Democrat from Wisconsin, spoke about that GAO report at a hearing 2 weeks ago. And I think they showed some real bipartisan, it was a real strong bipartisan conversation about how do we address these issues moving forward. So hopefully good things to come on that front as well. So just great to hear folks looking to work together on that front. To your point about what's being done, I think, this is a continuation of what we've seen in a change from the last administration, with more emphasis on domestic procurement and domestic manufacturing of pharmaceuticals and essential inputs. We saw that in the executive order last August that came out that looked at this. And this administration has continued down that path. We heard Congresswoman Hartzler talk about the 100-day review that's out there currently for active pharmaceutical ingredients. Especially on the Hill as well. I mean, there's a bipartisan effort in the House with the Pandemic Preparedness Caucus to look at these issues, with Congresswoman Trahan on the Energy and Commerce Committee as one of the co-chairs. And we see the same effort in the Senate as well. I did mention briefly Senator Schumer's competitiveness bill that we expect in the coming weeks. I think we'll see pharmaceuticals and critical inputs addressed in that bill as well, and what policies can be implemented to see long-term success for companies like Phlow and Nexus. So I think there's a real strong interest on a bipartisan basis. I think there's an understanding that there is a problem, that we have these, issues about shortages, about warning letters with, foreign manufacturing. I think there will be, only more policy put in place as we proceed this year. And I think there's been a real sea change from, say, 5 years ago as folks, how they look at this, especially COVID, helped accelerate that. Maybe it's a catalyst to help folks really focus in on our needs, but certainly a continuation and only in a positive way. So it's been great so far.
Well, thank you, John, for keeping track of all that and engaging with members and their staffs on the Hill. I want to turn to Usman and Eric and ask you a question. If you were asked to give a speech to the joint session of Congress on this subject, and if you wanted to make one or two recommendations to Congress on federal policy changes that would support companies like yours, other domestic manufacturers, to rebuild our infrastructure, to sustain it, to grow it, what would you suggest them to do? Usman, you want to take a crack at that?
Sure. I would say the two most important points I would say is, one, leveling the playing field, so ensuring that the same oversight that happens domestically is happening overseas. And then two, I know with GDUFA legislation being hopefully, I think 2023 or 2022. So I would say making some sort of incentives to prioritize domestic manufacturing. So those would be the two big points that I would definitely like to tell them.
And GDUFA is the Generic Drug User Fee Act, where generic drug makers have to pay a fee in return for the FDA conducting inspections, as a way for the FDA not to put it on taxpayers and to get money from the manufacturers to do inspections.
Correct. Yeah.
Yeah. Eric, so what would you tell Congress in a joint session?
Oh, there's so many, but since you only have me focusing on two, I'll give you my two big ones. The first is...
Maybe three, if you've got three, quickly.
Perfect. I got three quick ones. Number one is the Phlow program, through a unique federal government public-private partnership, started this concept for a strategic active pharmaceutical ingredient reserve. It's called the SAPR, as a part of the pandemic. So basically we said, listen, the strategic national stockpile should not be utilizing taxpayer dollars to purchase finished dosage forms, finished vials and syringes, the most expensive form, putting that form into a stockpile, and then you have to manage the demand of that, obsolescence strategy. You don't know when it's going to need it. instead, we propose let's get these main components, the key starting materials and the APIs, onto U.S. soil and start manufacturing them here. And then let's securely store them and have a rapid conversion strategy where when we see in times of increased demand, natural disaster, trade dispute, or a future pandemic threat, you can rapidly convert that product into a finished dosage form that costs hundreds of millions of dollars less. The shelf life of the active ingredient is 5 to 10 years, sometimes even more, versus the sterile drug that might be only a year and you have to throw it out. So it just makes much more sense to do that. We've started that program, we've operationalized it, we're building a facility, but it needs to actually be long-term sustainable. So I would codify the strategic API reserve into law and model it exactly like the strategic petroleum reserve that we have in this country, and then have other companies participate and become strategic public-private SAPR warehouses throughout the country. So that's number one, because
yeah. Before you go to the others, I want to go on this one, but go ahead. Finish this one.
So what, the SAPR?
Yeah, finish the SAPR, yeah. Before you go on to the others, I want to jump in on this one. Go ahead, but finish what you're going to say.
Yeah, I was just going to say, because the SAPR, if you just have that alone, we've now secured our country's most critical active ingredients that are the most vulnerable for supply chain disruption. In March 2020, India shut down the export of 26 active pharmaceutical ingredients. They said nothing's leaving the tarmac. With that threat at hand, we must have a critical stockpile of our key ingredients until such time that we can make it here. So that's number one. Rosemary, and then I'll tell you the two others.
Yeah, so what you're saying is, just for everybody to be on the same page. So the active pharmaceutical ingredients, that's what makes a medicine. And what we're calling for is, let's stockpile those, because that's where we're really vulnerable in terms of dependence on other countries. And during the pandemic, we learned we couldn't make these drugs because we didn't have the API. So what you're suggesting is, let's make the API here and stockpile that.
That's right.
So for the next pandemic, within weeks, we would have a finished drug facility right next door and turn that active ingredient into finished drugs.
That's right.
To meet the needs of hospitals around the country and friends around the world. Is that right?
And we use proactive data response. We'd see when a shortage is on its way, turn on pulling that API from the reserve, we don't have surge capacity on our fill lines in America. Right. No one does that in this country. And so what happened with COVID is everyone sucked up all the fill finish lines for the vaccine production, and you're going to have additional drug shortages as a result, mark my word. And so what we're saying is the federal government invests in a rapid conversion API, you reserve capacity, and then when we have a drug that goes into shortage, or the price spikes, or an API plant in India gets hit by a typhoon, we have that drug ready to go and we can serve the American population. It is a national public health security resiliency play. The second thing is we should look into providing expedited ANDA approval processes. So abbreviated new drug application is what's required to get a generic drug approved. If you have a domestic manufacturer with domestic components applying for an abbreviated new drug application, they should be moved to the front of the line. So a prioritization legislation and policy for domestic ANDA providers would be huge. I agree with Usman's tax incentive for domestic manufacturers. And then the third would be, what would happen if we granted market exclusivity? 6 months of market exclusivity turns into a year, or you get 6 additional months of market exclusivity if your generic is made in the United States of America as compared to someone else. So the generic market really had this 6 months priority exclusivity that really drove so many individuals into making generics in the first place when we were struggling in making generics. What if we did the same level of exclusivity through prioritizing those that were made here? Watch what would happen. So many companies would bring back their API manufacturing to the United States of America if they knew that they were going to be prioritized first when a branded drug went generic, and they were going to get the exclusivity first if they chose to make it in the United States. a simple change with profound implications for our future.
You know, Eric, as I hear you speak, I think about how our country prepares for hurricanes. We prepare for natural disasters. But what we don't prepare for is a shortage of medicines that occur as a result of these events. And so we're totally unprepared. And what I hear you saying, these are measures to ensure we have some plan. It's not just having a stockpile, but we have a plan of what we can do and how we can move forward while we're in the midst of a crisis. At the same time, we're trying to build domestic manufacturing capability with those incentives. And
you know, companies often work quarter to quarter, Rosemary. Yeah. For-profit companies, they keep an eye on that quarter, right? Those quarterly results. And the United States government is kind of short-sighted. We focus on what's right in front of us. But our competitors, our adversaries, we're not competing. We're not competing with a Chinese company. We're competing with the Chinese government. They're playing the long-term view, and they're thinking about what they need to do to win 10 years from now. We have to start thinking that way as a country when it comes to these key critical medicines.
That's right. We play checkers and they play chess. John, have we gotten any questions or comments coming in from our chat?
Yeah, we have some questions here. I just love Eric's idea about the exclusivity, though. Maybe we'll, instead of Waxman, we'll call it Edwards Ahmed or something. But no, it's a great point.
That's great. Okay, that's something to work on for CPA.
There we go. There we go. The question coming in from our chairman, Zach Model. He wants to know, why isn't there liability for these hospitals, drug companies, bringing product in, selling medicine that's under warning letters, and providing care using substandard and dangerous, unregulated products? Is there any sort of liability on these hospitals that continue to purchase, products under warning letter? Eric, Usman, or Rosemary?
Well, I'll take a stab at it. Let's take the contaminated blood pressure medicine, or even the contaminated heparin that killed hundreds of Americans at least. It is so difficult, if not impossible, to show cause and effect that if a medicine made by a company that I take when I'm a patient in the bedside, that it was that medicine, especially if I have a lot of chronic illness, that it was that medicine that caused me or someone I love harm. And I saw this when researching the heparin tragedy. It's virtually impossible. And if you're a family trying to make that case, you can't even find out what batch that medicine came from because the hospital won't tell you. So it's very, very difficult. And I call this the perfect crime. You can put a really bad drug out there and to really track it down and to hold accountability. We've set up a system that makes it really hard to do that. But it's a great question, Zach. Thank you for asking it.
I know we're wrapping. I know we're wrapping up. I'll just say that, in addition to Rosemary's point, sometimes that substandard medicine is the only medicine available. Mm-hmm. And so a physician and a healthcare provider is put into that horrible, horrible situation, which is we're either going to give something that may not work or might not be the most safe and efficacious drug because there's no alternative. And I've seen that situation with these pediatric hospitals all the time where they're trying to figure out what do we do here if this is the only drug that's available, or it might be a drug that's expired and they're asking the FDA to extend shelf life dating, even though it might have additional impurities. Some drug might be better than no drug in certain critical circumstances. And unfortunately, our hospitals are faced with that as well.
And those are explicit decisions that the FDA makes probably every day.
That's right.
Because it knows if it puts, and here's the reason for that warning letter, why that warning letter comes out, Usman, that if the FDA stops that company from exporting to the US, there'll be dramatic shortages. And so they have to weigh which is worse. So that's a huge motivator for us to draw a conclusion to our terrific panel discussion today. This is why we have to work to support domestic manufacturers. It's why we have to advocate federal policies to bring it home, to build that infrastructure and to sustain it and grow it. And I want to express my deepest appreciation. And I want to also express my respect to you, Usman and Eric, and for what you and your companies do. I've earned a hearty respect for what it takes to make every pill, every vial, to get it right every single time, every person, every day.
Appreciate that. Thank you, Rosemary.
It's an enormous undertaking, with tremendous responsibility. And this is what we should be supporting in America. These are the standards that we've grown up with that we should come to expect. So my deepest respect to you. And John, I want to thank you for your tremendous contribution at CPA to advocate and lead those efforts on the Hill in the administration and even in growing the membership of CPA in the Healthcare Committee so we can move this agenda forward. So on that note, we'll call the end to our session and we look forward to more of these to come. Thanks again and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you all.